Tuesday, 6 June 1944. Dawn broke over the gray waters of the English Channel as Allied commanders waited to see whether the largest amphibious assault in history would fracture under fire or force open the door to Western Europe. And in that moment, the outcome mattered not only for the men landing on the beaches, but for every senior commander whose future operations depended on a foothold in France. General George S. Patton, sidelined in England and officially without a field command, understood better than most what was at stake, because the success or failure of the invasion would determine when, and whether, his own army would ever be unleashed. On the eastern sector of the invasion front, Canada's 3rd Infantry Division moved toward Juno Beach with a mission defined by urgency and risk. Unlike later campaigns where momentum could be rebuilt after setbacks, the landings allowed no second attempt. The Canadians faced fortified coastal defenses, obstacles placed deliberately to wreck landing craft, and German units trained to counterattack rapidly before beachheads could be consolidated. Their orders required not only survival on the sand, but a rapid push inland to seize key road junctions and high ground before German reserves could respond. The pressure on Canadian commanders was immense. Intelligence suggested that elements of the German 716th Infantry Division defended the coast, supported by armored units from the 21st Panzer Division positioned to strike inland. Timing was unforgiving. Tides, naval gunfire schedules, and air support windows all imposed constraints that could not be adjusted once the assault began. Every decision carried immediate consequences, and hesitation threatened to unravel the plan. As Canadian assault companies hit Juno Beach, they encountered resistance heavier than anticipated. Sea conditions scattered landing craft, delaying some units and compressing others into narrow killing zones. German strongpoints survived the initial bombardment and opened fire at close range. Casualties mounted rapidly, threatening to stall the advance before it truly began. Yet small unit leadership proved decisive. Junior officers and non-commissioned officers reorganized scattered men, bypassed strongpoints when possible, and pressed forward under fire. By mid-morning, Canadian forces began breaking through the coastal defenses. Engineers cleared exits through minefields and obstacles, while infantry pushed inland in coordinated bounds. The terrain beyond the beach offered little immediate cover, increasing exposure to artillery and machine gun fire, but speed became a form of protection. The faster units moved, the less time German defenders had to reestablish coherent resistance. Canada's 3rd Division achieved something rare on D-Day: depth. While other Allied units fought desperately to secure and expand shallow footholds, Canadian battalions advanced several kilometers inland, reaching objectives that planners had expected to take far longer to secure. This progress was uneven and costly, but it forced German commanders into a reactive posture almost immediately, disrupting their ability to organize a decisive counterattack against the beachhead. The consequences of this advance extended beyond the Canadian sector. German commanders, uncertain about the scale of the breakthrough, hesitated to commit reserves decisively. Reports of Allied armor and infantry pushing inland created the impression of a larger penetration than actually existed. In war, uncertainty amplifies fear, and fear shapes decisions as powerfully as facts. The Canadians' progress thus exerted pressure disproportionate to their numbers. Patton followed these developments closely from England. Though officially assigned to command the fictitious 1st U.S. Army Group as part of the Allied deception plan, he remained deeply engaged with reports from Normandy. For a commander whose doctrine emphasized speed, aggression, and relentless exploitation, the Canadian advance represented something he valued intensely: momentum achieved under fire. At that stage of the war, Patton's own 3rd Army remained uncommitted, waiting for the breakout that would allow armored forces to sweep across France. He understood that, until a firm lodgment existed, his vision of maneuver warfare remained theoretical. What the Canadians accomplished on D-Day, and in the days that followed, was precisely the kind of operational opening he had long advocated but could not yet execute himself. The comparison was unavoidable. Patton commanded vast armored formations trained for exploitation, yet for the moment he could only watch as others fought the decisive initial battles. The Canadians, operating under conditions of extreme uncertainty and without the advantage of massed armor, achieved penetration through discipline, coordination, and initiative. Their success challenged assumptions about what infantry divisions could accomplish under fire. Canadian commanders faced their own constraints. German counterattacks materialized throughout the day, particularly from elements of the 21st Panzer Division attempting to split the Allied beachheads. These attacks threatened to isolate forward Canadian units that had advanced aggressively. Decisions had to be made quickly, whether to hold ground at risk of encirclement or pull back to maintain cohesion. The Canadians chose, repeatedly, to hold when possible, accepting risk to preserve initiative. This willingness to absorb risk reflected an understanding of consequence. Losing momentum on D-Day could doom the invasion even if forces survived tactically. Canadian units therefore balanced caution with audacity, reinforcing forward elements just enough to withstand pressure while continuing to push reconnaissance and patrols deeper inland. This approach magnified German uncertainty and stretched defensive responses thin. As days passed, the Canadian sector remained one of the most active and contested areas of the Normandy front. The terrain around Caen favored defense, and German commanders concentrated armor and artillery to halt further Allied advances. Progress slowed, casualties increased, and the initial breakthrough did not translate into immediate operational freedom. Yet the achievement of D-Day endured as proof that decisive movement was possible even under the worst conditions. Patton's reaction, as reflected in his writings and later recollections by those around him, was shaped by professional respect rather than sentimentality. He did not romanticize the Canadian achievement, nor did he dismiss it as luck. Instead, he viewed it as validation of principles he believed essential: speed, pressure, and the refusal to yield initiative even when conditions were unfavorable. At the same time, the comparison sharpened Patton's own impatience. He understood that his army, once committed, would be expected to achieve similar results on a far larger scale. The Canadians had demonstrated what was possible with limited means. Failure by an American field army equipped with overwhelming resources would be far less forgivable. The pressure of expectation grew alongside anticipation. The Canadian 3rd Division's performance also influenced Allied operational planning. It reinforced confidence in the feasibility of sustained pressure against German defenses, even in terrain that favored the defender. This confidence shaped subsequent decisions to launch attritional battles around Caen while preparing for a breakout elsewhere. The Canadians' experience thus fed directly into the strategic calculus that would eventually open the way for Patton's long-awaited advance. What Patton said, or implied, about the Canadians cannot be separated from this context. His remarks reflected admiration filtered through a commander's understanding of cost, risk, and consequence. He recognized that what had been achieved on Juno Beach was not a miracle but the result of disciplined execution under extreme pressure. For Patton, this made the achievement more instructive, not less. As the Normandy campaign dragged on through June and July, the contrast between static, grinding battles and the promise of maneuver warfare remained stark. The Canadians continued to fight in some of the most difficult sectors, absorbing punishment while holding ground essential to the broader Allied plan. Their experience embodied the reality that not all victories look dramatic, and not all momentum is immediately visible. When Patton's Third Army finally entered the fight after the breakout from Normandy, it did so on ground made possible by weeks of hard fighting by British and Canadian forces. The speed and freedom of his later operations rested on foundations laid under conditions far less favorable. The achievement of Canada's 3rd Division thus remained a quiet benchmark, a reminder that decisive outcomes often begin with disciplined endurance rather than spectacular breakthroughs. The interaction between Patton's ambitions and the Canadians' achievements illustrates a broader truth about World War II. Success emerged from the interaction of multiple commands, each operating under unique pressures and constraints. Admiration between commanders was rarely sentimental. It was analytical, grounded in an understanding of what had been attempted, what had been risked, and what consequences had been endured. In that space between observation and action, the story remains open for deeper examination of how coalition warfare, leadership, and circumstance shaped the path from the beaches of Normandy to the heart of Europe. In the weeks that followed, the Canadian sector remained under intense scrutiny precisely because it embodied the strain of coalition warfare at its most demanding. British and Canadian forces bore the weight of German armored concentration around Caen, a burden that was neither accidental nor unintended. Allied planners understood that fixing German panzer divisions in place was essential if any breakout elsewhere was to succeed. The cost of this role fell disproportionately on units like Canada's 3rd Division, which fought under constant artillery fire, frequent counterattacks, and limited room for maneuver. The German command structure reacted to the Canadian advance with a mixture of urgency and rigidity. Orders emphasized holding ground at all costs, especially near Caen, which Hitler viewed as a political and symbolic objective. This inflexibility translated into repeated, costly counterattacks that achieved little operational gain but inflicted casualties on both sides. For Canadian commanders, each engagement became a test of endurance rather than movement, forcing them to adapt from the fluid actions of D-Day to the grinding reality of positional warfare. Patton observed this evolution with a dual perspective. On one hand, he saw confirmation of his belief that German armor, when denied freedom of maneuver, could be worn down through sustained pressure. On the other, he recognized the danger of attrition consuming time and resources that might otherwise be used for decisive exploitation. His frustration was not directed at the Canadians' performance, but at the strategic necessity that kept his own forces idle while others absorbed the enemy's strength. Canadian units adapted to this environment by refining defensive coordination and counterattack procedures. Infantry, armor, and artillery integration deepened as experience revealed the patterns of German assaults. Rapid response to breakthroughs, aggressive patrolling, and the use of terrain for concealment became essential skills. These adaptations did not produce dramatic advances, but they prevented collapse, preserving the integrity of the Allied front during a critical phase of the campaign. The human cost of this role was significant. Casualty rates climbed, and battalions rotated through the line under constant stress. Letters and diaries from Canadian soldiers reflect an awareness that their struggle, though less visible than sweeping advances elsewhere, was central to the war's outcome. This awareness sustained morale even as progress slowed, reinforcing a sense of purpose grounded in collective responsibility rather than individual achievement. At higher levels of command, the Canadian experience influenced assessments of German resilience. Intelligence analysts noted that despite heavy losses, German units retained cohesion when defending prepared positions. This observation tempered expectations for rapid breakthroughs and reinforced the need for overwhelming force at the chosen point of attack. The Canadians' ability to hold ground under such pressure thus informed the timing and scale of subsequent Allied operations. Patton's eventual activation of the Third Army in late July occurred against this backdrop. When Operation Cobra shattered the German front in the American sector, it did so partly because German reserves had been pinned and depleted elsewhere. The Canadians' earlier advances and continued pressure contributed directly to this imbalance, even if the connection was not immediately visible on the battlefield. As Patton's columns surged across France, the contrast between mobility and attrition became stark. His operations showcased the kind of maneuver warfare he had long advocated, yet he remained acutely aware that such freedom depended on conditions created by others. The Canadian experience served as a reminder that not all decisive contributions are measured in distance advanced or enemy formations encircled. In private reflections, Patton acknowledged this interdependence more readily than in public statements. He understood that coalition warfare required acceptance of unequal roles shaped by circumstance rather than preference. Admiration for the Canadians' achievement lay not in imitation, but in recognition of the discipline required to endure prolonged pressure without losing effectiveness. The legacy of Canada's 3rd Division in Normandy thus extends beyond any single remark attributed to Patton. It resides in the structural reality of how the Allied campaign unfolded, where success depended on the synchronization of endurance and exploitation. The Canadians demonstrated what could be achieved when initiative was seized early and then sustained under relentless strain, providing a foundation upon which others could maneuver. This dynamic underscores a central theme of World War II, that outcomes were shaped by layers of decision-making under uncertainty, each carrying consequences that rippled outward. The interaction between Patton's ambitions and the Canadians' experience reveals how leadership, pressure, and coalition dynamics intersected in ways that resisted simple narratives, leaving the story open for continued examination of how victory emerged from both movement and endurance. As the summer of 1944 wore on, the Canadian sector did not recede into the background of Allied planning. Instead, it became a reference point for understanding how German forces behaved when cornered, exhausted, yet still dangerous. German commanders opposing the Canadians increasingly relied on ad hoc formations, combining depleted infantry units with fragments of armored regiments. These formations lacked the cohesion of earlier panzer divisions, but they remained capable of sudden, violent resistance, especially when supported by well-sighted anti-tank guns and artillery. Canadian intelligence officers began to notice subtle changes in German tactics. Counterattacks became shorter in duration and narrower in scope, suggesting a decline in available reserves. Prisoner interrogations revealed units thrown into battle with minimal preparation, sometimes arriving directly from railheads or forced marches. This information filtered upward through Allied command channels, reinforcing the assessment that German strength was being steadily eroded, even if the front lines appeared stubbornly static. The pressure on Canadian commanders intensified as expectations grew. Having proven their ability to land successfully and hold ground, they were now expected to continue advancing against defenses that had been reinforced precisely to stop them. Operational plans reflected this tension. Attacks were carefully timed, artillery support meticulously calculated, and objectives limited to what could realistically be held against inevitable counterblows. Each decision balanced the desire for progress against the risk of overextension. Patton followed these developments closely, not merely out of professional interest, but because they shaped his own operational freedom. The Germans' commitment of armored forces against the Canadians reduced the likelihood that those same units could be redeployed southward in time to counter his advances. This understanding sharpened his impatience and reinforced his belief that speed, once unleashed, would compensate for earlier delays. On the ground, Canadian soldiers experienced the war as a series of localized crises. A hedgerow held one day might be lost the next, only to be retaken at significant cost. Night fighting became common, with both sides probing for weaknesses under cover of darkness. The psychological strain of constant alertness weighed heavily, yet discipline remained intact, sustained by competent junior leadership and a clear sense of mission. The interaction between Canadian and British forces also evolved under this pressure. Coordination improved as units learned each other's methods and limitations. Shared artillery resources and overlapping defensive zones created a more resilient front. These practical adjustments mattered more than formal command arrangements, demonstrating how coalition effectiveness often emerged from necessity rather than doctrine. German commanders, constrained by directives to hold ground, found themselves reacting rather than shaping events. Attempts to regain the initiative faltered against prepared defenses and overwhelming Allied firepower. The Canadians' ability to absorb these blows without collapsing contributed to a gradual shift in the operational balance, one that became increasingly difficult for the German High Command to reverse. As Allied forces began to exploit breakthroughs elsewhere, the Canadian front assumed a new significance. German withdrawals, when they occurred, were often abrupt and disorderly, revealing the cumulative effect of sustained pressure. Canadian units advanced cautiously into territory that had been fiercely contested only days before, aware that retreating enemies could still inflict damage if underestimated. Patton's commentary during this phase reflected a more nuanced appreciation of the campaign's complexity. While his public persona emphasized aggression and movement, his operational reports acknowledged the interconnected nature of Allied efforts. The Canadians' role, once seen primarily as holding action, now appeared as an integral component of a broader encirclement strategy that was taking shape across northern France. The consequences of this realization extended beyond Normandy. Lessons drawn from the Canadian experience influenced planning for subsequent operations, including the management of extended supply lines and the integration of multinational forces in fast-moving campaigns. Endurance under pressure, once viewed as a defensive necessity, became recognized as a prerequisite for exploitation elsewhere. Within the Canadian ranks, the transition from attritional fighting to cautious pursuit marked another shift in mindset. The war was no longer solely about survival and holding ground, but about pressing a weakened enemy without losing cohesion. This adjustment required restraint as much as aggression, reinforcing the discipline that had carried the division through its most difficult days. These developments illustrate how the actions of Canada's 3rd Division resonated far beyond their immediate objectives. Their experience shaped perceptions, informed decisions, and altered expectations at multiple levels of command. The story continues to unfold through the interplay of pressure and opportunity, revealing how sustained effort in one sector created conditions for decisive movement in another, leaving further layers of analysis open as the campaign progressed. As the front continued to shift eastward, the Canadian formations encountered terrain that posed a different set of challenges than the hedgerows of Normandy. Rivers, canals, and shattered towns imposed natural pauses on momentum, forcing planners to reconcile ambition with logistical reality. Bridges were often destroyed, roads cratered, and civilian infrastructure reduced to rubble, complicating movement for armor and supply columns alike. Each delay carried operational consequences, as German forces sought to stabilize new defensive lines even as their overall situation deteriorated. Canadian engineers became central to sustaining forward movement. Under intermittent fire, they repaired crossings and cleared obstacles, often working at night to avoid observation. Their efforts allowed infantry and armor to maintain contact with retreating enemy units, denying them the time needed to regroup fully. These technical tasks, rarely dramatic in isolation, collectively shaped the pace of operations and underscored the interconnected nature of modern warfare. German resistance, though increasingly fragmented, remained adaptive. Rearguard actions were designed to slow Allied pursuit, using mines, demolitions, and well-placed machine gun nests to exact a cost disproportionate to the forces involved. Canadian units learned to anticipate these tactics, advancing methodically and coordinating closely with artillery observers. Fire support was applied with precision, reflecting lessons learned earlier in the campaign about conserving strength while maintaining pressure. At higher levels of command, the cumulative impact of Canadian advances influenced Allied assessments of German capacity. Reports highlighted declining morale among enemy troops, shortages of fuel and ammunition, and growing reliance on inexperienced replacements. Yet these weaknesses did not translate into immediate collapse. German discipline, reinforced by harsh measures against retreat, prolonged resistance, and ensured that each kilometer gained required careful planning and execution. Patton's operational tempo accelerated as these conditions unfolded. The constraints faced by German commanders opposing the Canadians limited their ability to respond effectively elsewhere. This imbalance reinforced Allied confidence in coordinated pressure across the front, validating earlier decisions to accept slower progress in some sectors in exchange for strategic advantage overall. The campaign's rhythm emerged not from uniform advance, but from the interplay of varied tempos along different axes. Within Canadian units, the experience of sustained combat fostered a pragmatic approach to leadership. Junior officers balanced initiative with caution, aware that aggressive action unsupported by logistics or intelligence could quickly unravel hard-won gains. Non-commissioned officers played a crucial role in maintaining cohesion during rapid advances, translating orders into action under uncertain conditions. Interactions with liberated civilian populations added another layer of complexity. Canadian soldiers encountered communities exhausted by occupation, their reactions ranging from relief to guarded caution. These encounters required sensitivity and discipline, reinforcing the broader political dimensions of military operations. Maintaining order and securing lines of communication became as important as defeating enemy units in the field. As autumn approached, weather emerged as a decisive factor. Rain turned roads into mud, reducing mobility and straining vehicles. Air support became less reliable, placing greater emphasis on artillery and ground coordination. Canadian forces adapted by consolidating positions and preparing for operations that accounted for reduced visibility and slower movement. These adjustments reflected an understanding that environmental conditions could shape outcomes as decisively as enemy action. German command decisions during this period reflected a narrowing range of options. Orders emphasized holding key terrain to delay Allied advances, even when the tactical value of such positions was questionable. This rigidity contrasted with the increasing flexibility displayed by Allied commanders, who exploited opportunities while avoiding unnecessary attrition. The divergence in approach highlighted the broader strategic imbalance that had emerged. For Canada's 3rd Division, the campaign had evolved into a test of endurance and adaptability. Their actions continued to influence Allied operations beyond their immediate frontage, reinforcing the principle that sustained pressure in one sector could shape outcomes across an entire theater. The narrative remains open, shaped by the ongoing interaction of decisions, constraints, and consequences that define the latter stages of the war in Western Europe.